community a really long time. Member of, when I looked at his bio, I was stunned at how many organizations he's been involved with in the county. It's just, the list goes on forever. I always, when I met him, I only knew him from like 3 or 4, a handful of organizations, but I was amazed. He's in everything. So really fortunate and grateful that he's taking the time to talk to us today. And I look forward to his discussion on the air quality. This is kind of a follow-up to the presentation he did a few weeks ago on water. This is the air quality portion. So I missed the water one. I apologize, but I'm here for this. So let me bring up the slides and then we'll get started. Just a second.
And while you're doing that, let me just, by way of short introduction, say that for 30 years, I have been the senior vice president of an organization called the Construction Industry Air Quality Coalition.
Ooh, didn't like that, huh? Oh, we had a hiccup.
Yep, was to look at, the regulatory side of those things that affect construction activity, because it's obviously going to add to the cost of construction. So the organizations that belong to that are the Associated General Contractors, who are largely the erectors. They build large things, the buildings, freeways. It includes the engineering contractors, who are the sort of the in-ground guys. They do a lot of flood control, storm drain, street curb gutter, that kind of activity. The Southern California contractors, who are largely the dirt movers. They do some bridge work, but they're mostly the guys with the big yellow grading equipment that you see moving dirt around a job site. Can we go up to the slide number 1?
Yeah, let me just get this so that people can see it there. Everybody see that okay?
Yeah, but that's not number 1. There we go.
Thank you.
Right. And then if you'll jump to slide number 2.
All right.
And then the fourth organization is the building industry.
Dennis, is it helpful for you to go to slideshow?
No, that's what gave me the hiccup.
So the Building Industry Association of Southern California, who are largely the home builders. So those organizations all contribute through their labor contracts 7 cents an hour to a fund, and that's 7 cents an hour for every hour that a union employee works. So operating engineers, cement masons, laborers, they pay into this trust fund, which is managed by a group of management trustees. This is only managed by management. And it funds our Construction Industry Air Quality Coalition. It funds a sister water quality organization. It funds scholarship programs. It funds industry-wide safety programs. It funds something called Force Account, which is a group that just looks at municipal agendas to make sure that cities are actually contracting out construction work rather than trying to do it with their own forces, which is against state law, but you'd be surprised how many cities try to do that. So if you want to flip to the next slide, we also have, as members of our group, the United Contractors, which is largely a Northern California organization, the San Diego Associated General Contractors, who are different from all the rest of the state, and then some consultants who specialize in air quality issues and do a lot of consulting with the construction industry. Flip to the next slide. We have to compete for a competitive grant every year to continue our funding, to keep our activities going. And as I said, it's a provision of the labor agreements that provides the funding for this program and for others. So if you want to flip to the next slide, Okay, Kickwick is a water quality group that a sister organization, which I also oversee for the construction industry, dealing with water quality regulatory matters. The next slide. Here are the things that we're focused on primarily. And I wanted to do this air quality presentation sort of in the context of our industry so we can talk about how it affects all sectors in the economy. But just to give you an idea of the things that affects in construction, our off-road equipment, which is all the big yellow equipment that you see on a job site, the bulldozers, the scrapers, the graders, the water trucks, the rock trucks, all of that equipment and its emissions and activities, frankly, are regulated by either CARB or the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Our on-road trucks are also regulated. We have to report on those. The portable equipment, which is the welders, the generators, the pumps, the compressors, all of the things that you see on job sites to do other pieces of equipment or other pieces of work or maintain the other pieces of equipment. The forklifts are also regulated. And then we have a new area of regulation called indirect source rules, which I'll talk about a little bit more about later, which is on new development and redevelopment. Indirect source rules is a deviation from traditional means of controlling emissions. Right now, emissions are controlled at the tailpipe. So if you have something coming out of an activity, out of a tailpipe, you're required to bring those emission levels down to a certain level over time in almost every activity that exists. Indirect source rules are an effort to control the behavior of the person who owns the tailpipe. In other words, you can buy an automobile that pollutes, but we're only going to let you drive it 3 days a week, kind of a concept. It makes making them responsible for the emissions and reducing the emissions by changing their behavior rather than through technology, because there isn't technology to reduce emissions any further. So you're going to see a lot more indirect source rules as we move forward. The first one that was adopted here locally, you probably read about recently. It's a warehouse rule where the warehouse owners are now going to have to keep track of all the trucks coming and going from their warehousing activities. And they're going to have to start to implement strategies that will reduce the emissions from the activities of those trucks, even though they don't own those trucks or control their movements. So if you want to flip to the next slide, a quick lesson on air pollution 101. Let me give you the traditional air pollution. We think about smog as being air pollution. It's technically called ozone, ground level ozone. We call it smog. It's made up of three components, really. Diesel exhaust, which provides NOx, nitric oxides, gasoline powered engines, which is primarily the automobile, which provides VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds, and then sunlight. You combine NOx and VOCs and sunlight and warmth in the air, and you get smog, you get ozone. They recombine to make ozone. Here in South Coast, and frankly, the state of California, for probably the last 20 years, in order to control ozone, we have pursued what they call a NOx-only strategy. Rather than trying to bring down both NOx and VOCs at the same time, they're counting on the turnover in the automobile fleet to reduce VOCs as the cars get cleaner, and they're focusing on NOx. And NOx comes from trucks. Anything diesel, or including airplanes, ships, trains, and all of the equipment that we just talked about in the construction industry, plus others. So this NOx-only strategy is a little bit risky, and I think you'll see why when I start to explain where we're at. Because we know for probably 30 years that there's something called the weekend effect. And for those who measure air quality, on the weekends, there is normally a higher ozone levels than there are during the week. And this happens in about 35 major cities in the country. And it took them a long time to figure out why that was. But it turns out that on the weekends, you have a lot less diesel and you have a lot less NOx being generated because you don't have as many trucks on the highway. Construction isn't working. Maybe the ports aren't working. Whatever the case is, NOx emissions drop considerably on the weekends. But automobile driving doesn't necessarily. And when you bring NOx down quickly, but you don't do anything about VOCs, you wind up with higher ozone, higher smog levels. Now, for the first time ever, LA, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which is composed of the 4 counties, LA, Orange, San Bernardino, Riverside, as one air basin, is not going to meet a national air quality standard. We're not going to meet the 70 parts per billion 2015 national air quality standard. Now, we're only going to miss it by a tiny, tiny bit. And given the severity of the air pollution in this region, which is nationally is classified as severe non-attainment, it's not. I mean, for the air quality regulators, it's a aha moment that they're not going to make it. But the fact of the matter is, I believe in part it's the strategy that they've been pursuing. So we have, in order to meet the standard, you can only have 3 exceedances at a monitor in 1 year prior to the year that you have to meet the standard. So the 2015 standard I think that the deadline is 2023. We are gonna have 2 or 3 monitors that are gonna have 1 or 2 exceedances beyond the allowed limit. That's out of 36 monitors. So it's not like it's a huge miss and a huge tragedy. There are penalties for not meeting it. The penalties have been on the books since the 70s. The penalties have obviously never been implemented because there hasn't been any place in the country that they haven't been able to meet it. It's not terribly likely that California or South Coast is going to get punished because they missed it by a hair. But it was a little bit of a wake-up call, so it's caused the regulators to sort of go into overdrive to figure out what do we have to do to make sure we meet the next deadline. Now, just to back up for one moment, there are sort of 2 regulatory bodies who oversee air pollution in California. You have the local air quality management districts, which here in the South Coast, we have the 4-county region. And there are, if they're not in an air quality management district created by the legislature, then every county has an air pollution control district. So there are 40 some local air pollution agencies controlled largely by local elected officials. Their primary focus is mobile stationary sources. So buildings, factories, manufacturing, any sort of stationary source that doesn't move. The State Air Resources Board, which is another body statewide, is appointed by the governor. That agency is responsible for mobile sources. Now, when we get into this a little more, you're going to learn that they trip over each other a little bit because, the CARB doesn't think that the local guys are doing enough to control emissions from local sources, and South Coast doesn't think that CARB's doing enough to control mobile sources, and that's what one of the, so there's a little headbutting from time to time over who has responsibility for what and who's causing who's causing us to miss the standards and not reduce the pollution. So what's the overall strategy? If you go to the next slide, here in California, we've made some strategic decisions at this point, which may or may not pay off in the long run. We've put a lot of emphasis on wind and solar for electrical generation because electrical generation is one of the biggest sources of pollution in Southern California. It's the power plants. It's the peaker plants that we use because they're primarily gas operated, because they can be started up on a moment's notice and they can be turned off when they're not needed. We have over time eliminated a lot of our local generation, our old power plants, and we now depend on generation from out of the region, which is not a very good strategy probably in the long run, but that's the direction we're heading. We're going to rely less and less on locally generated power. We shut down the Songs nuclear power plant down near San Diego. The Diablo Canyon, which is the last nuclear power plant left in the state, is closing down, recognizing that these were massive sources of electrical power. They are also renewable, even though in California they're not considered renewable. They are everywhere else in the world. And by getting rid of those, we've left a big gap in our need. We also have, the public power, what do they call it? Public safety power shutdowns, which allows the Edison and the electric companies to turn off power in high winds in order to prevent forest fires. Those are going to become more and more frequent. It's going to take at least a decade for the electric companies probably to armor their systems enough that they can keep power on without having to turn it off. So we're going to have electric shortages, if you will, some created by generation decisions, others created by weather circumstances. We've still got issues with grid reliability. The projections I've seen are it's at least a decade before we get the grid to a point where we've invested enough money in it that we can depend on it reliably for long periods of time. And again, the generating capacity is going to be problematic. We in order to reduce combustion, we're relying more and more on electrification, but we're not building electrification system fast enough to keep up with the electrification that we want. And that gets back to automobiles. The governor's order or direction that by 2035, you won't be able to buy or sell a vehicle in California that isn't a zero emission vehicle, which means it's either got to be today's technology, it's either got to be electric or it's got to be fuel cell. Those electric vehicles all need to be repowered or recharged daily. They're looking to electrify virtually anything that moves, and they're looking to electrify virtually all living and working circumstances. So you would use electrification for water and space heating and cooking, which is not something that we do now. So you're putting an enormous demand on an electrical system that we're not bringing up to speed fast enough. And along with that, and all of this is driven by air quality considerations on the premise that somehow electricity can be generated without creating emissions. And that's probably only true if it's done outside of the region, which makes us dependent on someone else providing us what we're going to need. And that's going to be problematic as the pressure mounts for more and more, as the demand mounts for more and more electricity. So you've got issues with battery storage is one option for wind and solar, which you don't have half of the day on a good day. We still have a rare earth minerals problem, and that we're not mining lithium to any extent in the US. We're dependent largely on it from China or from mines in South America that are owned and controlled by the Chinese. We've got supply chain issues that we haven't dealt with, and we've got China being able to threaten limits on exports of the materials that we need to create electricity, be it copper, be it lithium, be it for storage batteries, whatever the case may be. So those are all sort of looming in the background. If you want to jump to the next slide, I'll work through these next ones kind of quickly, just to give you an idea of what the construction industry has to deal with on the regulatory side. Off-road, currently, the off-road rule, which has been in effect since 2008, requires that by 2023 and 2028, depending on the size of your fleet, you have to meet a progressively lower and lower fleet average emission standard. So that standard's been in place for 10 years. It keeps shrinking over time. So what happens is whatever fleet you started out with, you've got to every year, you have to report to CARB what equipment is in your fleet, what year it is, what its emission level is, and you have to calculate your fleet average, what the average emissions is from all of your equipment combined, and it has to be under a certain number. And that number keeps getting lower and lower as we get to 2023. So what that basically does is force the contractors to get rid of their older equipment and buy newer equipment, which is a lot more expensive than they're used to paying for equipment, in order to keep their fleet average down so that they can keep their fleet in compliance and they can stay in operation. We're now looking and talking to CARB and South Coast about, they're saying, okay, everybody's going to be in compliance. They've been in compliance for the last 10 years. You're going to hit the final number in 2023 to 2028, depending on the size of your fleet. What are we going to do beyond that? Because that number isn't good enough anymore. We need it even lower. So they're going to now talking about trying to require the elimination of even more older pieces of equipment, which aren't going to be very old. You can't have a very old piece of equipment and still meet the fleet average anymore. So they're going to try to force the turnover of the not so new equipment for absolutely new equipment, and or changes in the fuel. They're looking at changes in the fuel mixture and things of that sort as another possibility. So that's on the off-road side. Next slide.
Mike?
Yeah.
Real quick, is there a threshold as to what size fleet needs to meet these? I mean, if you're a small business, are you still required?
There's no exceptions. Yeah, everyone is required to. They're broken down into horsepower ranges. So if your total horsepower range of your fleet is, say, under 500, you're a small fleet. If it's between 500 and 2,500, you're a medium fleet. And if it's over 2,500, you're a large fleet. Well, okay. If you own 3 scrapers, you're over 2,500 horsepower. So those horsepower limits are not very high. So if you have 1 or 2 pieces of equipment, you might be considered a small fleet, but much more than that, you're either going to be a medium or you could be a large fleet. So the next slide, if you will, on-road trucks, same thing. Our construction industry has a lot of on-road trucks. We use them to haul, for water trucks, we use them to haul equipment. We use them to haul, rock, sand, and gravel. And currently, you have to have a 2007 or newer truck to meet the current standards for your fleet. That standard is going to move to 2010. By 2023, every truck on the road has to be 2010 or newer, which is the latest technology available for emissions control. And what the state is now looking to do is impose, trucks currently don't have an annual vehicle inspection program like you do for your automobile, which you do every 2 years, where you have to get it smogged. They have what they call a smoke test, where you take a device and you hold it up to the exhaust just to measure the amount of smoke and the amount of particulates in the smoke, and it tells you whether you're meeting the standard or not. They're going to move away from the smoke test. By going to the 2010 or newer trucks, they have the technology in them that you can plug them into a device and it will tell you whether they're functioning at the level they're supposed to. The only problem with that is the state wants you to do it 4 times a year instead of once a year or every other year like you do for automobiles. So it's going to get expensive for anyone who owns a truck just to do the quarterly reporting that the state is currently proposing. If you want to move on to the next slide, forklifts are becoming a big target now. The forklift, traditional forklift, you think about as a small hard wheels. It runs around on a concrete floor in a warehouse. Those trucks are already generally propane, which is very low emissions. The state wants them to become electric, so there's 0 emissions. they're setting a measure in place to mandate that. The larger truck forklifts that are used in the construction industry, we call them rough terrain because they work in the field. They have large rubber tires. They usually lift. They're big. They're diesel. They use to lift big things. They're not something that can easily be converted to electric and still be reliable because they can't generate the horsepower that's necessary. So we're struggling with the regulators right now on exactly how do we deal with those, because there are a lot of those in the fleet owned by construction companies as well. And then if you flip to the next slide, portable equipment, as I said, that's the welders, the compressors, the small equipment, the small horsepower equipment that's used on every job site to do just about everything you need to do, whether it's maintenance or run, nail guns and things of that sort. So they're not a big part. There's only about 50,000 of them, we think, owned by the construction industry that are currently registered. And I think we've got most of them registered with CARB. But because they're small, they don't have the expensive emission control devices on them that bigger equipment does. So they become a bigger slice of the emissions pie, and CARB is looking at ways to electrify those as well. Obviously, for the construction industry, electrification is a problem because we work in places where there isn't any electricity. We're usually the ones putting it there. So it becomes problematic for us to how are we going to charge equipment and keep it working if we're at a location where electricity isn't even available. If you'll flip to the next slide, indirect sources. As I indicated, the district has adopted a warehousing indirect source rule, which basically requires the warehouses to report every year the comings and goings of the trucks coming and going from their site. They have to begin implementing strategies to reduce the emissions from the activity of those trucks, not necessarily, doing things like installing electric charging stations, hoping that that'll help people switch over to electricity or electric trucks if they have a place to charge them. Taking other measures, limiting hours of operation, things of that sort to reduce the activity in and out of the warehouses, but all of it aimed at reducing emissions by controlling behavior rather than direct emissions. They're looking at doing similar measures at the ports, LA and Long Beach, possibly at the airports, and they're looking at doing it for new development, which would, make it, what can you do in a new commercial project to get people to either not come there as often or come there in a zero emission vehicle rather than a regular vehicle. And they're trying to develop strategies to do all of that. If you want to flip to the next slide, greenhouse gases are considered a pollutant, although it's hard to justify something that most of society and most of anything that grows on the planet needs in order to exist. However, greenhouse gases have become a massive focus for both CARB and South Coast Air Quality Management District. Greenhouse gases are produced less by diesel activity and much more by automobile activity. And this gets back to the idea of we need to switch to electric now. An awful lot of electric generation is still going to come from gas sources, from natural gas, until they find a way to create massive amounts of battery storage to store what might be generated during the day from wind and solar. So there'd be the demand for electricity has shifted from midday to late afternoon to early evening. If you notice on your electric bill, the premium that you pay now for electric consumption starts at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and goes till 9 o'clock at night, instead of from, 11 o'clock to 3 o'clock, which is when it used to be the peak period. The problem, obviously, for that period of time is that's when a lot of people would be plugging in their electric cars, and that's when the demand is going to go up, and that's why the rates are being set to push the demand, push people into trying to use electricity other times of the day when they can flatten out the demand curve, if you will. So, so as I said, in our case, diesel activity doesn't contribute much to greenhouse gases. It's primarily automobiles, which is back on the focus that the governor's given to his executive order to require that only zero emission vehicles be sold in California after 2035. I think there's some argument to be made. I mean, everybody assumes that's electric. Yeah, I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I think most of the auto manufacturers, if you heard the president of Toyota yesterday said it's too early to be talking about electric as the final automobile propulsion system. Elon Musk has been saying we don't have enough electricity to power all these electric cars. We're asking everybody to drive. So I think there's some big issues looming that have to be resolved in order to get us to that solution. I happen to think fuel cell in the long run is probably going to turn out to be the more likely option. The environmental community doesn't like that because it requires hydrogen, and hydrogen can be made fairly easily from fossil fuels, and they don't want any fossil fuels to come out of the ground at all. So that's an issue that we're going to have to deal with, down the road, 8-10 years from now, probably, when fuel cells become a lot more practical and a lot more affordable. And the auto industry has been investing in fuel cell technology for 30 years. They never thought of electric as an option, a viable option. I know they're producing electric vehicles now in order to satisfy largely the regulators and the politicians, but even they, I think, in the long run, see fuel cells as probably the long-term option. So if you'll flip to the next slide. For us in the construction industry, we think that we're always going to need a diesel tech option, particularly for the very, very heavy duty equipment that requires the horsepower and the torque that you can't generate with electricity. It's a lot more, the technology is to the point now where a brand new diesel bulldozer is as clean as the natural gas engine. The emissions are 90%, 99% reduced from what they were 20 years ago. There are some options that might work for certain types of equipment, for some backhoes and some excavator type equipment where they have a movement to them that they can generate electricity as the machine turns. They could do some kind of a hybrid, and there have been some hybrid developed that are very expensive to operate. The contractors don't like them because they're expensive to operate, and they go back to diesel as soon as they can. But in the very small equipment, tiny, skid steers, the little things that you see, one guy climbs in and he uses a couple of sticks to drive it. Some of those may work very well as electric, and there is some movement to at least bring the very low horsepower stuff over to an alternative technology. So you'll hear discussion in the air quality world about particulate matter from diesel being a toxic health risk. At one time it was. There was back in the 80s. Back in the 80s was the last time that there was any premature death attributable to particulate matter. You would never know that listening to the regulators. You think it's happening every day, and in fact, it hasn't happened in decades. So the cancer risk has been decreased substantially, and and as has the risk of premature death. So if you flip to the next slide, we got one or two more to go and we'll be done. What we're pushing for the regulators to do is to update the emissions inventory. We do not believe that the construction fleet, and I can tell you other industries feel the same way, generates the number of emissions that were being attributed to us. We don't work the number of hours that we used to. The engines are cleaner. We think the emissions models that they're using are out of date, and we've asked CARB to update the emissions model because we think by doing that, they're going to find that we're not contributing as much overall emissions as they believe we are. We want to stop the forced turnover that they're pursuing. We think that if they, with a more natural turnover, with some incentive money, when they first developed this rule and they put incentive money on the table, which the contractors had to contribute to as well, we repowered hundreds and hundreds of scrapers in Southern California and these were, big engines, 500, 600 horsepower engines. Some of them had 2 engines in them. We repowered those, hundreds of them, to get early emission reductions because we would get credits for doing it. And that reduced the emissions substantially and much earlier than they had anticipated. So there was a real public benefit for that. So the other thing we're pushing for is we think they need to start banning old automobiles. 50% of the air pollution generated from automobiles comes from 10% of the cars on the road. And it's the oldest vehicles, and there's no reason for them to still be on the road. They have banned old engines in every other sector of the economy for decades, except they won't touch the automobile. And until you get to that single action alone could reduce the VOCs enough that we would meet all of the standards. We'd be well ahead of them. We wouldn't have to do the rest of the stuff we're doing, but there's no political will to do that. So if you flip to the next slide, and we can stop on this one, just to give you an idea of the things that we're doing. We actually have a lawsuit going against the state against the feds, I should say, over the waiver that they gave California for the off-road rule, because California can't adopt a separate standard without federal approval. The feds jumped over all the steps they were supposed to go through to give them approval 20 years ago, and this lawsuit's been mushing around all this time. And so we said at least make them go through the hoops that they're supposed to go through. The newest thing in California is AB 617. You're probably going to hear more and more about that. It's designating disadvantaged communities and setting up advisory boards in those communities. There are probably 10 of them now in the South Coast district. My concern, and I think industry's concern generally, because they don't want business people involved in these advisory boards, is these communities are going to wind up getting redlined, because their contention is that because they're disadvantaged communities, but they're also suffering from more emission impacts than the rest of the community, and they want extra air quality regulation to offset that. The risk in that is those communities are going to get redlined, and nobody's going to want to be open a business in those neighborhoods if they have to meet tougher air quality standards than they would if they went 6 blocks away. So that's problematic, and yet to see how this is going to fully evolve. But the state is spending tens and tens of millions of dollars funding the staffing for these disadvantaged community organizations. And as I said, there's about 10 of them here in Southern California now. And yet to be seen exactly what direction they're going to go in terms of how they treat these communities different than the rest of the air district. The state has to produce an implementation plan every 3 years showing what they're doing for the feds in terms of meeting their air quality goals. We have been telling the feds for a decade that we're reducing vehicle miles traveled, that you and I are driving less, and collectively we're driving less. Therefore, we're getting an emissions benefit from that. Nothing could be further from the truth. Vehicle miles traveled has increased every single year for that whole 10 years. But we keep telling the feds that it's going down when it isn't. At some point, that's going to come back to bite us. And that gets back to this whole idea of we need to get those old automobiles off the road because they're the ones that are causing the bulk of the problem. And it doesn't matter how many miles you drive. Ultimately, if we believe our rhetoric and we're all going to be driving electric vehicles with no vehicle emissions, why does it matter how many miles we drive? It doesn't. It shouldn't. It's not an air quality issue. It might be a traffic issue or a congestion issue, but it's not an air quality issue. But that right now is being used as the means to not build more roads, not widen more freeways, not do all the things we need to do to eliminate congestion because it will increase vehicle miles traveled. The fact of the matter is we've failed miserably in reducing vehicle miles traveled with all the other incentives we have with carpools and buses and trains and all the other options. We've just never been able to do it. It's in fact gone up during that entire time. The state auditor also just recently issued a report saying to CARB, you have all these incentive programs, you're spending literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year giving people money to do things that supposedly reduce emissions, but you don't collect enough data to demonstrate whether those programs have been effective or not. And the auditor really, really, really took them to task over that, and the fact that they can't demonstrate any socioeconomic benefits from this hundreds of millions of dollars in greenhouse gas money credits, as an example, that they collect and turn around and give to somebody else to reduce emissions. So, and the governor's electric vehicle mandate, I think, is probably terribly unrealistic. He wants 5 million zero emission vehicles on the road by 2030. There's about 700,000 today, and we're only registering the new vehicles at a rate of about 250,000 a year. So it's not likely we're going to get to 5 million and by his goal. And his additional goal is to, no vehicles that aren't zero emission to be sold after 2035. So if you want to flip to the
Mike, if I
skip
can
the next one and go to the one after that, we can wrap this up.
Okay.
Go ahead,
Mike,
Monica.
I have a quick question.
I don't know where it went. All right. So anyway, that's my summary. I made this presentation a couple of weeks ago to the Asphalt Pavement Association, and it's hard to find anything funny about asphalt, but I managed to find something and put it in my slide. So thank you for your time. I hope this was informative, and I hope if you've got questions about what's going on elsewise or otherwise in the air quality arena, feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to let you know.
Go ahead, Monica.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike, when you were talking about the goal of having the cars go with zero emissions and everything, and the trucks and stuff that are on the road now, I mean, do you guys realize the impact this will have on business in California as for a lot of these either small businesses or businesses that require their trucking to have to change their whole fleet sometimes to meet these conditions? What do you think that's going to do to business in California?
The biggest problem right now, frankly, is the two things with the new trucks. One is the cost. They're substantially more expensive to buy a new big rig than they were. The electric are going to be even worse. But the other one is reliability. I mean, I talk to contractors all the time. One of the contractors is a woman. She's the president of a company that does the concrete barriers in the middle of the freeway. And she said, I bought this brand new truck. I paid $180,000 for it so I could get rid of my old truck so I could bring down my fleet average. But she said the thing's so unreliable. It's got a malfunction light coming on all the time. So it's always in the shop. So she said, I had to keep my old truck so I have something to use when my new truck's in the shop. And that complaint we hear a lot from everybody about the reliability. The emissions controls and the other thing, you're going to start seeing a lot more big rigs parked on the side of the road, and they're parked there because their emission system shut down. They're very, very touchy And the systems are now designed so that you can't drive the truck if it's not meeting its emission standards. So you get a light that comes on and you got about 20 seconds to get off the road before the engine shuts down. So, you know, and you're going to see a lot more truck fires because those things are terribly hot. They have to be terribly, terribly hot to burn off the particulate matter. So, you know, it's going to take some time for the technology to really catch up, but right now it's expensive and it's not terribly reliable. And those are the biggest complaints that I get from people all the time.
So, Mike, are you telling us that truck repair shops are a good new investment opportunity?
Ooh.
Well,
They probably will be. I mean, there's millions of, you know, there's 1.5 million trucks in California. Big rig trucks. I mean, that doesn't count the box trucks and all the others that are going to be subject to this new provision as well. You know, the shuttle buses, all of them have similar engines and similar emission systems. Some of those are much more easily convertible to electric, but the technology is still not reliable enough for a lot of applications. And you got to remember, a lot of these aren't big fleet owners. These are people who own 1 or 2 trucks, by and large, and they can't afford to have one go down on them with some regularity. It's just not. It gets in the way of their business operation. So we haven't figured that out. We just can't come up with something that's reliable enough yet.
Sounds like the opportunity for a value measure rather than just a quantity measure.
Well, you know, the regulators, that's not their problem. You know, they say,
well, that's true.
It meets the test. You know, it's what we want. But the fact that you have to put it in the shop every 10 days is irrelevant to them.
Yeah, it's like you say, though, when they're trying to make a requirement as far as how many emissions are supposed to go out there, they should have viable options, at least workable options for people to do that.
Right.
I propose having some sort of option available to them. Makes it difficult.
Any other questions?
Oh. Learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That was excellent. Really, really good. Really appreciate you stepping up.
Thank you, Mike.
Adding your expert voice to educate us. So there aren't any other questions. I know a couple of people popped in and out. Yolanda popped in and then had to leave. So just so everybody knows, she popped in. And so I think with that, we will end our session and do our four-way test like we do every week. So how about we get that going? So first test.
Is it the truth?
Truth.
Second test.
Is it fair to all concerned?
Third test.
Will it build goodwill and better friendships?
And fourth test.
Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
All right, everybody. I'm going to say goodbye and thanks for coming in, Mike. Thank you very much. He's already gone, but that's okay. We'll see you next week, folks.
Can I have a minute with you, Dennis?
Oh, all right.
Oh, come on.